Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Abhijit Baduri. I work as a talent and branding coach. And in this podcast, I actually showcase careers of people. When you ask everyone, or you can ask anyone, how did you land up being where you are today? The answer is so fascinating. And that is really what got me hooked onto writing more and studying about careers. And eventually, of course, as I was a career coach, it gave me a chance to interview a lot of people and learn from them. Today, the person that I am going to bring on as my guest is somebody who has something in common with me, which I'll come to right at the end. But what was also interesting is this person's belief in himself changed because he got the third rank in a general knowledge test in school. And that sort of really set the person thinking that maybe I'm destined for better things. But this person has an amazing amount of knowledge and interest in all kinds of music, starting from Carnatic music to Hindustani music and rock and roll and Brazilian and Greek music. And, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. He actually is better known for some of the fascinating books that he's written. I was recommending this in a show that I was doing on LinkedIn Live with another guest of mine. And I said that both books are brilliant and I love them. I completely recommend that. But I am going to today introduce him as a person who was my super, super senior at XLRI. And ladies and gentlemen, wait for this. On to the show. Don't go away. Huggy.
Abhijit, the pleasure to be here.
So good to have you on the show, Huggy. Huggy has a complicated first name, which is Huggy Rao. For the benefit of uneducated people like me, what does Huggy mean? I know it's a name of God, but
Yes, it is. Huggy is supposed to be an incarnation of Vishnu. In this incarnation, anyway, it has to do with saving knowledge from the Asura. And that's kind of what the story is. So usually it's a name particular in certain communities in southern India. So in some communities, we worship Ganesh as the god of knowledge. In other communities, Hayagriva is the god. And by the way, while I'm at it, I may as well tell people as to how I got to be called Huggy. Due to a random chance event, I had a great uncle who went to Yale. And then he married a wonderful American woman called Mary Campbell. And Mary Rao came to India and lived in Bangalore actually for 50 years. And so she had a little bit of difficulty in enunciating Hayagriva. It sort of got shortened to Huggy. I think she gave me a great gift. Don't you think so, Abhijit?
I completely agree. It's so much easier to say Huggy, and so I'm going to sort of stick to that. And you also describe yourself as Huggy.
Please do that. And, you're, of course, the talent and branding expert. It is an interesting branding cue, if I may so say.
Completely it is. And Huggy, you are, of course, besides, of course, your journey as an author, and we'll talk about all of that. Huggy and I both went to XLRI, and we're sort of, if you stack rank, Huggy was the gold medalist. I was also the same list, but at the other end of this list. But nevertheless, it's an amazing journey that everyone has at XLRI. Huggy is no different. Was that when you decided that you wanted to pursue your career as an academic?
I wish I could share this with viewers that it was my decision. It really was. When I went to Excel, I was a very young kid. I'd come from a small town, Vishakhapatnam. I was good at studying and taking tests and things like that. But I didn't have a whole lot of exposure. And I go to XLRI like many other people do in those days. I'm talking about 78 to 80. We all wanted to be executives, and I too wanted to be an executive. But then 75% or more of my classmates suggested I was better suited to the profession of being a professor. When I would ask them, they say, you love the research behind, anything that is taught in class. But most of all, you like to complicate things, and you can never complicate things in the real world of business. So you'd never make it. And I thought to myself, is it real? When 75% of your classmates are kind of telling me that, clearly they're seeing something in me that I'm unable to see myself. And I think this is sort of a point I want to make about careers, and that is careers are about realizing possible self. And one of the difficulties all of us have is sometimes we can't see our possibles. We become too narrow, too constricted. And it's your colleagues and those who have affection for you, they're able to actually see your possible self in sharper relief than you. And then what you've got to do is you've got to you can't simply say, oh, they're saying, I want to be a professor. And you got to say, let me find out what preparing for this career is all about. And here I'm deeply grateful to the faculty and the then Dean Sudas Roy. And, I told him, man, I'm kind of finding this coursework to be kind of a little boring, It's really not that interesting. And I'm thinking of doing my PhD, and maybe I should actually do some independent studies. And right then, look at another random event. Jitu Singh comes to XLRI from work. And Sudas says, why don't you talk to Jitu? And so I go talk to Jitu and say, hey, can you help me with an independent study spread over a couple of terms? And Jitu, of course, made sure I read his first year doctoral readings at the Wharton School. But most of all, Jitu gave me another gift. Every week, I remember I had to go to his room. He used to stay in the dorms at that time. He was unmarried. But he had, of course, a much more luxurious room, and he had a fantastic sound system. And he loved classical music. And that was the first time I listened to, Beethoven's Ninth or Third, Brahms and Bach, many of which were conducted by Herbert von Karajan. Prior to that, I must tell you, I had no idea of Western classical music. So when I think of my own sort of career, I would kind of describe it as a lot of random draws or chance events that had nothing to do with me, that occurred and that created openings and that presented a possible self to me. And so that was, I think, Excel's great gift, because it created a safe enough environment where you could try on any self that you wanted. You wanted to be a rock musician, go for it. You wanted to be an actor, go for it. And I think that kind of wonderful permissiveness was something I had not encountered. And it was fun being with people much older than me. And because I was the youngest, they were very generous with me. I still remember a wonderful friend of mine, now in Sydney, Australia, Mohan Abraham, affectionately called Mopes. He looked at me and said, Huggy, I was around and studying when you were but a gleam in your mother's eye.
Oh, guys. Yeah, that's incredible statement. And you have been teaching at Stanford now. Do you think that the students who come in today are more clear about their career plans? I'm still unclear about what I want to do, but
I just see a dramatic difference. And perhaps age and time have made me nostalgic. I'm seeing the past through the gauze of wonderful nostalgia. But really, when we were there in 78, 80, we were only just grateful to be there. The second thing is, I don't think anybody thought about a career. I don't think anybody thought about strategy and this, that, and the other. We just had a great time. And there was something called placement season where vaguely you had to strategize, because you could only go for so many final interviews and this, that, you remember. And that was the only time you had to think about it. But then my impression was we all got jobs within, in those days, it wasn't within 2 days, but maybe within a week or 10 days, is what I vaguely recall. It all happened very fast. And then you had one more term. I wish I could say that we spent the one more term preparing for new jobs. But that was the last thing on our minds. We just had more fun. And so I think there was no instrumentality, is the way I would say it. It's like, oh, I don't need to get to know Abhijit because Abhijit's will get me into connection with this network or that network. It just didn't, those kind of thoughts never crossed at least my mind at that stage. But the students now, at least the ones I see at Stanford, they're much more kind of, as you implied, focused, goal-driven, and so on. And the way I would kind of describe it is, at the time when I was at XLRI, I didn't realize choosing a job. I vaguely sensed it, but I couldn't formalize it, Abhijit. But you kind of realized instinctively that choosing a job wasn't just choosing a set of activities and an employer. You really were choosing a version of yourself. But I don't think we did that deliberately. I must confess, I kind of sleepwalked into it, as you can recall from the story. But the kids I see at Stanford Business School, they're very explicit about the kind of self they've chosen. Most of them come to Stanford because they want to choose an entrepreneurial version of self. And so they have their stories, but it's wonderfully inspiring. So I teach a class, for example, here called The Future of Work. And I was challenging our MBA students who take it. It's a lab for future of work related startup hypotheses. And I said, look, the future of work doesn't mean the future of work for people who work in, Microsoft or Google, or for that matter, Goldman Sachs or TPG or anything like that. There are a lot of frontline workers. What's the future of work for them? What can you do for them? And it's amazing how our students actually responded to that. Some of them now have startups trying to improve the world of work for the hourly work. Just amazing. I feel very touched by them. So they have a lot more drive. They know they're going on a 10-year startup journey. It's like very different kind of orientation. Very different.
Is it better to be focused in today's context? You talk about the future of work, and I'm just intrigued. Would you say that it's a better idea that you know exactly which direction you want to go in, what do you want to do, why do you want to do it, all of that? Or is it a better idea to meander around a little bit, sample a bunch of things, and then make up your own mind about what works best for you?
It's a great question. I think the way I would respond to it is it's kind of different strokes for different folks. So the way I'm interpreting your question, Abhijit, is, hey, do you kind of want to be a little bit of an explorer? Or do you kind of want to be somebody, you've got a map and you know where to get to, and that's kind of what you're going to do? I think I would kind of prefer a little more exploration. One is I've done that myself. I find it certainly kind of helpful. But the other thing is you don't want to kind of prematurely commit to a version of yourself without checking out what the possibilities are. It's kind of like you're asking me, hey, how do you want to eat in a restaurant? Do you want to look at the menu of possibilities when they give you the menu? Or do you just say, maybe I'd like come here just to kind of have an omelet or an idli and dosa, and then that's all I care about. And I really don't care about the other things. I would find that to be sort of odd. To give you an example, the other day we were at Los Angeles and we were in this, my wife and I, we'd gone for our birthday and we were at this restaurant, and suddenly we see a thing which was, if you can believe it, tuna poke with crispy rice. And when you really look at it, you quickly realize all that they did was brilliantly combine tuna poke with the Indian bhel. Now, I'm eating bhel, but obviously it's a different kind of bhel. You see what I mean? So if you only say I want bhel, you probably would never get this kind of dish. And other possibilities like that. So my preference always is for a little bit of exploration. And the earlier you do the exploration, the better, because the cost of a mistake is lower.
Does it mean that when, you scale up your career, and you've written this absolutely fantastic book, which is called Scaling Up Excellence, getting to more without settling for less? Professor Bob Sutton was also on my show some time back. We had a chat.
Mm-hmm.
And another brilliant book, The Friction Project. I've
Thank
loved
you.
both your books. And I'm going to sort of ask you a question, and you can sort of point to either of the books and really talk about it. When you said that you sampled some ideas, opportunities, possible selves, I like that phrasing, and I'm going to steal that. That I think that when you look at, here are things that I can do, you look at the possibilities. The more you are able to imagine, the easier it becomes. So, I think that's one part of it. But how do you scale it up from there? Because I might aspire to this grandiose dream I have for myself. How do I achieve it? So how do I remove friction along the career journey, and how do I scale it up?
So, that's a great question, Abhijit. The way I'm going to answer your question about how do you scale yourself? And that is like the core question. Because what do I mean by scaling ourselves? I mean all of us having a bigger footprint and hopefully a better footprint. Most of us think of scale as having a bigger footprint, not a better footprint. We really need to have a better footprint. Now, from my perspective, one way to kind of think about it is you really got to carefully think about, and this kind of channels some of the arguments we make in our friction book, is what you want to do is you actually want to choose jobs so that your curious and generous self is activated. And the key to kind of doing that is to make sure you're doing jobs where a lot of bad friction is kind of removed. Friction, come to this in just a little while. For us, friction When I say odds, I mean Bob Sutton and I. Friction in organizations is kind of like cholesterol. We got good cholesterol, we got bad cholesterol. We got good bacteria, we got bad bacteria. It's the same thing with friction. Some obstacles infuriate people, and not only do they infuriate people, what they do is they overwhelm us so much that they prevent us from being curious in general. You really want to avoid organizations like that and, frankly, jobs. At the same time, all of us know as human beings, we can easily choose a more overconfident and more myopic version of ourselves. So you need jobs with good friction. That is, obstacles that slow us down, that make us deliberate and think through a lot more clearly and better. There are a range of ways to do it. Pay careful attention every time you're looking at a job. What are the obstacles involved in the job? And if you ask me, the real role of leaders is to be trustees of other people's stuff. The most important thing is you need both focus and flow. Flow has to do with initiative, energy, all of those kinds of things. When you take bad friction out, people flow a lot more easy. They can do things on their own. They don't need to check with the boss. You can kind of really act as an owner. On the other hand, you need to get people to focus, to look carefully at things, to slow down, to consider alternative hypotheses. And that's kind of where you need to put in good friction. So my view is the real thing of a leader is carefully to think about what obstacles am I going to take out so that the right things become easier to do? And what obstacles do I put in so that the wrong things become wrong? And the most important thing is when you're in a job, you are allowed to be curious and generous. I think, all of that kind of opens your mind up so much more significantly. Let me give you an example. Now, I wish I could tell you it was my own sagacity and ingenuity. It so happened that when I joined the Tatas, I was with the Tata Management Training Center in Pune with Francis Menezes, who was my first boss. Francis was like a very good boss, and I'm very grateful to him because he gave me opportunities that I don't think anybody would have gotten at my age. I was like 20 and a half or 21. And I don't know how he would do all of this. Before I knew this, I would be writing a note for Mr. Kohli of TCS or Mr. Tobacco Wala. The amazing thing that surprised me is they would read my notes and ream me out for 2 hours, telling why all of the things I had put down in the note were so far into the future and completely implausible in the present. And it was like an education, And I would wonder, why are they wasting their time on a guy like me? And I could just say, man, this doesn't make any sense. No, but they really wanted to educate me. And for that, you remain very, very grateful, very, very thoughtful. And different executives change your life. We had two other colleagues in Pune, Ram Narayan and Neelakant. They had come from America because they'd done their PhDs and they joined Tata Steel with Francis Menezes. So I was with them and they never treated me as like a rookie or anything. They saw that I'd done Jitu's 1-year doctoral readings and I was reasonably familiar. And they really gave me enormous opportunity. I remember going to IPCL. And that was the first time I realized a lot of what I knew about organizations completely ignored society and was kind of like, in that sense, like very limited and kind of restrained, because IPCL is no longer there. It's now part, I think, of the Reliance Group. But I remember going to IPCL and, the first thing I remember meeting was a mechanical engineer who asked me to come to a meeting of mechanical engineers. And they presented a regression analysis showing how mechanical engineers were punished in the promotion process. Like, Jesus. If you go to the chemical engineer, they say, we're not becoming factory managers. But this is a chemical company. The electronics guys are saying, Tiger, what are you talking about? Chemical engineering, mechanical engineering. Everything is electronics, like we should be the factory. On the one hand, that is happening. On the other, the HR department, I think, was like, a lot of Bengalis were there. The finance department had a lot of Tamilians. Marketing was full of good Jews. It was like India in miniature. And then you had a lot of trade unions. I forget the number of trade unions they had with the workers on the shop floor. And the head of the Officers Association was a guy from IMA. And I said, Yar, why did you create this association? So the guy looks at it and says, all of us think our immediate superiors are bozos. We need to talk to Dr. Ganguly, and this is the only way we get access to him. And was thinking to myself, like, how do you run an organization? And Ganguly, of course, was a brilliant guy. He was a PhD in chemistry from Imperial College. And I must have been 21. He asked me, he says, so young man, Huggy, what do you think I should do? So I looked at him and I said, Dr. Ganguly, the challenges facing IPCL, they actually are India in miniature. You have professional competition amongst the professions. You have competition amongst language groups. This is kind of India. And, if you ask me, the only way out is for you to build more plants. And he smiles and he says, why more plants? I said, more factory manager jobs and more this and that. So he looks at me and he says, so you think the answer lies in New Delhi? I said, you're a better judge of that. Like I wouldn't know. And he knew this all along, and which is why they actually were starting the Maharashtra gas cracker initiative, which was a huge initiative, created many more opportunities. And I think things like that, they kind of blow your mind. They completely blow your mind, and you kind of realize that you can't sort of think of like Mickey Mouse versions of organizational change. Some organizations are so complex that, you've got to think of other ways of doing things, and it's not like doing the conventional things that people do. So my point is, what you really need are tough assignments that put you at the edge of your knowledge. You're not doing things you're kind of doing most of the times things that you don't know. And I think that's like the
Sure.
important point. So I'm straying a little bit, but the point I want to make is choose jobs, pay attention to the structure of obstacles, make sure you don't get stuck in jobs with a lot of bad friction. Because all that you're doing is you're waiting like Godot for approval from the boss or filling forms or some other mind-numbing activity. But at the same time, don't think that if you're in a job without any speed bumps and stop signs and traffic stops and all that, that's not a good thing either, because rushing headlong into action without reflection is often a path to disaster. So you really need to look at both, and you got to luck out on mentors. In the end, what you really rely on is the generosity of people. Even when I came and did my PhD was not something I kind of considered in a very rational way. I'm going to apply to 20 places. I just loved Ram and Neelakant, the senior colleagues I alluded to you, and they came from Case Western Reserve University, and they said, you should really go there. And before I knew it, I was admitted I was going there. And I go there after 6 months. I quickly realized, they do some interesting things, but maybe all the things they do, they don't interest me. And so I had a choice. Did I drop from the program and go to another program? But then I realized even if I go to another program, formal coursework is going to be 1.5 years to 2 years. So after that, you're on your own, basically, working with advisors, of course. And that was when I realized the most important thing is you got to be able to teach yourself. And here again, the generosity of colleagues plays a role. And there was another graduate who was on the verge of became an assistant professor. He joined my committee. His name was Mohan Reddy, and he was amazing. He was much older than I was, much more informed, but at no point did he ever say, hey, these ideas are crazy, they're outlandish. He would always listen to me, and much to our surprise, we even wrote a couple of papers together and kind of did fun things like that. And then I eventually chose a dissertation topic for which I didn't do any coursework. It turned out I was sitting next to the accident of office allocation. I was sitting next to people in operations research. There were a lot of Indians in that group, a lot of Turkish people, a lot of Algerians too. And I remember once I was at the dump terminal. In those days, we needed dump terminals to access the Deck 20. So I'm looking there and, wondering what to do. And suddenly there is this voice that comes and says, Huggy, what are you doing? I said, yeah, I'm like trying to understand these hazard rate models and parametric distributions of arrival times. He said, I can teach you. I looked at him and I said, how do you know this? And he said, well, I'm from IIT Bombay, and my undergrad thesis was on the failure pattern of gearboxes in 5,000 BEST buses. So immediately he pulls up the data, he teaches me things, and it was amazing. So it does take a village to create a career is the point I want to make. And there are all these chance events that all kind of come up together, and we tell ourselves stories where we're the heroes of the stories, and I wish I could tell you such stories. But it's funny, you and I are talking about careers, Abhijit. Etymologically, career means a road or a race course, at least in French and Italian.
And the also dictionary also defines it as your journey through life, which is
That is exactly the point. And I think you hit the right thing on the nail, which is it's journey and not a destination. I think we're in trouble the moment we think of careers as destiny.
How do you sort of make sure that at different stages in your life, as you go through obstacles and everything, how do you make sure that you continue to have that kind of mindset that you think about it like a journey, not a destination?
Well, the first thing is you kind of realize that, at least in my case, and I would say this maybe generalizes to other professions too. What is my job as a professor, Abhijit? For me, fundamentally, it is to be curious. It is to be generous. It is to incubate curiosity and generosity in our students. And so, what you do in your job is it's all about being curious and generous on the job, asking questions, looking at research possibilities. Take, for example, the process to write a paper. It takes about 6, 7 months of hard work and research and analysis, and you're trying to make your results go away because other people will be skeptical of what you've done. And you want to kind of make sure it meets a high standard of rigor. So you need patience, and you can't say, I'm going to write this article and I'm going to actually publish it in this journal. Oftentimes, when we begin a research project, we don't even know which journal we're going to send this. All that you're thinking is this a good question? And for me, the way I think about investing in good questions is, does this question confuse me? And if I talked about the research that I'm studying or doing, if I talk to my mom or my grandmother, will they understand it and will they be interested? Of course, my wife is a professor too of gerontology and she understands research. I have to tell you, Abhijit and our listeners and the audience, I've given some papers to my wife, the person who loves me the most, and she's fallen asleep on some of my papers. I said, "Kya hua yaar?" Something so boring. I said, really? I spent 6 months showing there was this non-monotonic relationship or whatever cubic relationship between X and Y. She says, who gives a shit? And when the person who likes you the most is falling asleep, you gotta kill this idea. And the lot of life, to be honest with you, is killing ideas too. It's not like pursuing every idea that you have. You got to kill a bunch of good ideas so you put energy into greater ideas. And I think that's really what, to my mind, continually renews a career. Most of all, continually renews your curious and generous self. These things now I learned from my PhD students. They go to many more advanced classes in computational linguistics than I have. I don't have the time to do that. I wish I did. I study on my own, but in a research project, we're all doing this together. I know what they're doing. And every time I do any of these new techniques or whatever it is, I always say a prayer to my mom, who was a high school math teacher. She really taught me sound foundations, though I didn't appreciate her at that time. Now I do, obviously. So the reason I'm sort of sharing all of this is so many things go into a career, so many things go into a journey. And I think the reason you go in a journey is you're curious.
Your name is all about, conserving knowledge, protecting knowledge. Hayagriva, the deity is doing this. And you are also, pursuing academics, which is interesting because there is also, sometimes I wonder that people, how does that name influence their choice of careers? And I wonder whether that happens. Couple of things just for the benefit of our listeners, talking to Professor Huggy Rao, better known as Huggy Rao. Huggy has written these two fabulous books. One is called Scaling Up Excellence. The other is the book which I recently read, which is called The Fiction Project. Brilliant books. I absolutely recommend that you take a look at both of them. And we are today sort of really talking about some of the things that I learned in this conversation. I've summarized for you down there in the ticker below that. Teach yourself, what you don't know. Be ready to learn and teach yourself. I love that phrase which Agi talked about, which is that you become an accident of office allocation. He happened to be allocated an office next to somebody from a completely different team, and that led to some opportunities. And that it takes sometimes a village to create a career. So many people play a role in career. The other line that I really took away today was that, how do you treat your career like a journey and not a destination? And of course, the last one, which I love the phrase, you kill a good idea so that you can pursue a better idea, and everybody says, kill a bad idea. Yeah, we all know that. But the counterintuitive thing today for me was kill a good idea so that you can pursue a better idea.
Right. Right. And if I can dial down on two more things, we spoke about the Friction Project, but I want to just share an insight from our scaling book. One of the things that our book on scaling talks about, Abhijit, is scaling is not more of the same. Scaling is reinvention. I wrote a case study on the chief technology officer at Uber. He was the CTO. He's no longer the CTO, a brilliant Vietnamese guy called Tuan. And I remember asking him, hey, how long have you worked for Uber? And, he said 4 years, but it feels as though I worked for 16 different companies. I was like startled by it. What he was implying is each year has 4 quarters, and each quarter Uber was a different company. And if we take that analogy to our lives and indeed our careers, the most important thing is a career means reinvention. I mean, look at you, Abhijit. You're a great example of this kind of reinvention. I mean, sometimes when I sort of think about the avatar idea in Indian myth and philosophy, I love the avatar concept because it kind of gives you flexibility for this reinvention process. But in order to reinvent oneself, you need escape velocity. Otherwise, you're going to be doing the same thing. You were with Wipro, and then you had to get escape velocity to leave and do your own thing. And I think all of us need to figure out in this journey, a very important thing is making sure you're generating or paying attention to getting escape velocity. Because otherwise, the gravitational pull of what you're always doing is a huge problem that makes us myopic. So that's like one piece. We pour ourselves into our jobs. Most of us do. Our jobs consume us. And there was this young lady who told me this with a quiver in her voice, Abhijit. She looked at me and said, Professor Rao, I poured myself into my job. A lot of the job is doing bullshit work that exhausts me. And I said, and? She looked at me, and that was when she had a quiver in the voice. And she said, when I go home, she said, I have nothing but the scraps of myself from life.
Wow.
I think that is sad and tragic that people build lives like this. How can you build a life and a career and all that you've got are scraps for your family? Scraps of yourself. For me, in my own way, I like to practice curiosity. Curiosity and generosity are not traits, they're practices. You got to do them, otherwise you lose it. It's not like you have it and then that's it. It's not like a bank balance. It's like you got to constantly replenish them. And so what do I mean by it? So can you imagine coming, in my case, if I came home tired, and my wife too, being a professor, she comes home tired. What kind of dinner are we going to have? You want to say, man, let's actually make something quickest and fastest, which is probably going to be unhealthy, unsatisfying. So how do you create curiosity? In fact, we had this conversation during the pandemic. So she was saying, aren't you bored eating the same food? And I said, that's a really good point. She said, what do you think we should do? I said, well, one way to eat interesting food is to do randomization. She said, randomization? How are you going to do randomization? I said, pretty simple. I got an atlas. We have an old-fashioned physical atlas. Open the map of the world. I said, close your eyes. Take your left or right index finger. Zap it on a point in the atlas. And we'll cook food from there. So she closes her eyes, zaps it. Turns out it's in West Sumatra. She looks at me and says, West Sumatra, oh my God, what are we going to do? And I said, wait a minute, West Sumatra, wasn't it like on the traffic path of Arab and Indian traders? And I'm sure there's a lot of influence. And we found out there's a dish called the rendang that was specifically designed to last for voyages. And I said, let's kind of redo our version of the rendang. We don't need to do the West Sumatran version. So we did it and we loved it. But the amazing thing, though, Abhijit, was I had never planned to do this. After cooking the dish, I spent like a week or 2 weeks reading about Hindu maritime empires in Indonesia and the great battle between the Srivijaya Empire and the clever ambush conducted by the Chola Navy in the Malacca Straits. That's how the Srivijaya Empire got destroyed. And, how would you even come across stuff? She was saying, aren't you getting tired of Greek food? Yeah, Greek food can, you keep eating the same thing. Anybody will get tired of anything. And I said, well, maybe we can do something a little different. She said, what would that be? I said, everybody thinks Vasco da Gama was the guy to discover India. I mean, amongst the Portuguese and all that, maybe he was the guy to discover. But there were obviously a lot of sailors in Kenya who knew this before. It turns out the first Westerner to discover India was in 100 BC. He was a guy called Hippolytus. He'd figured out the monsoon structure. So you start in Greece, the southwesterly monsoons will slingshot you into Kerala. You wait until November, the northeastern monsoons will slingshot you back to Greece. I said, imagine you're in Hippolos, you're in Kerala, you're missing Greek food. What would you make? It's an interesting thought experiment, right? Suddenly it opens up kind of possibilities, Half the herbs that you get in the Greek islands, you can never get them in Kerala, but there are new things. What would you do? You get the idea. Simple thing like a moussaka, how would you make it very different? So my point is curiosity and generosity aren't just at like work, it's in life. One of the things I talk about is make sure you recruit your best self at work and at home. Because you don't do that.
Yeah. I also know that you've got a huge sort of knowledge about different kinds of music. You listen to a lot of different forms of music. Talk to me about your interest in that, and
you know,
how did you build that?
I appreciate music. I don't know how to sing. I think the last time I sang was in grade 8 in Kendriya Vidyalaya, and Miss Sundaram, who was the music teacher, said, I have to sing a song. And I said, would a shloka do? She said, you have to sing a song from a film. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, this is like a tall order. Miss Sundaram was a spinster of 50 years at that time. So this was the time of Aradhana, Abhijit. I'm giving you my age here. I must have been a boy of 8 or 10 or whatever it is. And I'm looking at Miss Sundaram and saying, Rupa Tera Mastana. Miss Sundaram said, stop. Immediately, I'm going to give you a pass grade. Please never sing this song again. She, of course, was embarrassed. But the thing is, Excel exposed me to many different pieces of music like Jitu, the rock and roll and all of that. But the other thing is, see, other people kind of are doorways. Like, when I've lived in America and now for like close to 40 years, one of the things we all do is we talk with our parents. And I discovered that, the conversations with my mom were like becoming good. Mom, how are you? Like I was doing yesterday. And then you kind of tell me, this conversation is going nowhere. Like I'm asking a series of pro forma questions and she's replying in kind, and it's kind of uninteresting. And then I knew that my mother loved Carnatic music. And then I thought, I need to create another channel of conversation. So then what I would do is like we're doing now, we would do it on FaceTime or WhatsApp or one of the two, or Skype or whatever. Play a piece of Carnatic music. And I say, Mom, do you remember the raga? Sometimes she would forget. But what I realized was just the act of me playing the music allowed her to tell me 5 stories about her child.
Wow.
And that made her happy. When you really think about careers and, all of this, we're all about our stories. I mean, I take your stories away. Are you going to be a unique human being? You are. Physically, you might, but like otherwise, you're like anybody else. Take away my stories. And I think the thing we have to think about is life is actually about constructing our story and continually editing the story. It's not like you write a story and say, I've done it once and that's kind of it. But you're, constantly editing the story, and that's kind of the reinvention. That's sort of what, in many ways, your wonderful book, Career 3.0, kind of gets at that, because the learning the ability to edit and re-edit. So in short, it's kind of funny. We think of ourselves as authors of our stories, and of course we are in one sense. But other people are authors too. But we are editors-in-chief of our story. And so...
I love that line.
You do? Well, I'm glad you do, because that's kind of who we are, right? You're the editor-in-chief of your story. And that's kind of what being in charge of your career means. There is actually a professor, Professor Wilson at the University of Virginia, and the technique he uses for people who are addicts and convicts and so on is the way to get them not to repeat the crime is to help them understand their story and give them the freedom and the agency to change their story, to edit it. And so let's think of ourselves as editors of our story.
Wow. That's really powerful. And that applies, in multiple ways. If you see yourself as, as whatever, I started my career in human resources, and I never ever thought that I would be a writer, and then I sort of, had a go at writing mediocre content. That was great fun. And I enjoyed that process. That opened up a different chapter of my life altogether. or that, that
I recall reading that lovely book of yours, and the way when I read it, it seemed to me that what you were doing is you were getting escape velocity, if you will, out of your role and out of the Excel experience. Right? You had to write the book and say, you know what, I'm awakening my skeptical self. You know, curiosity, skepticism is one form of curiosity. So.
similarly, when I thought that, would I ever become an entrepreneur? And I know you teach entrepreneurs at Stanford. I always, grew up with this phrase that was always told that, oh, Bengalis can never be entrepreneurs. And I thought, gosh, that's a challenge. And I must try it out someday. And I'm sort of so excited about that whole possibility of being an entrepreneur. And that's really something. But I sort of found that you can weave yourself in and out of different career journeys, like, to be an employee at some stage, to be self-employed, to be back as an
Right.
employee, back as an entrepreneur.
Really, that's exactly it. And all the time we're reinventing ourselves. Because if you don't reinvent yourself, we become kind of stagnant, become kind of boring. I want to leave our viewers with a story of an extraordinary woman who reinvented herself. We were in New Zealand. We were doing some kind of cruise. And, there was a young Indian girl, and she was just by herself. She looked at my wife and me and decided we were kind of Indians too. And my wife is a wonderfully generous person who loves to talk to any and every. Sometimes I kind of think, like, do you really need to do that? But at other times, I always tell her, I'm so glad you did, because I learned about something I never knew. Anyway, back to this young girl. So she asks us, how did you meet? And we tell her, we met in grad school and this, that. And so we said, what brings you here to New Zealand? And she must have been 20. And it was a heartrending story. Her parents were in the travel agency kind of business, international travel. She was like a Jane. She got married to a guy who was a schizophrenic. And nobody told her that her husband was going to be a schizophrenic. Her parents didn't know that. The in-laws obviously concealed. And here's this woman who was married. And you think, I got to take care of this block for the next 40 years. And it's like I have no vote in the process. Fortunately, her parents were amazing. They said, you don't need to do that. We made a mistake. You should take over the travel business. And what was the travel business she was doing? She would actually target high net worth Jain families and orchestrate vacations to places where Hindi movies had been shot. New Zealand was one such target.
Wow.
She said, that's what brought her to New Zealand. I said, but what brings you to this city? She said, oh, I came here she was 20 or 21. She said, I came here to negotiate with the Hilton. And I said, negotiate what? And she said, well, I'm coming with 50 or 60 very particular vegetarian Jains, and we come with our own Maharaj, who actually cooks. And so we want to stay at your hotel, but we want lunch and dinner and breakfast prepared by our own chef. And the first reaction of the hotel apparently was to say no. And then this young woman asks, what would you have said if I had belonged to the Jewish community? And said that I came here with 50 people belonging to the Jewish community and we only want to eat kosher food. Ordinary people can't make kosher food. You have to be blessed by the rabbi, etc., etc. You would have probably said yes. And to the credit of that hotel, they changed their policies. There she was. Unbelievable. I mean, now you're looking at and say, 20 years, you're going to be stuck with this guy whom you didn't know from Adam. And now you're set free. What do you do? And I was like very impressed with her, And then later I told my wife, I'm so glad you chatted with her. I think a lot of life is like that. We admire people. And I was once giving a talk in Bombay about scaling up excellence. I think at this company, Edelweiss. You would know of the company. And lovely people, Vidya and Rasesh Shah, are the founders. Lovely, lovely people. So I get off the car and, they have a beautiful terrace and they have like some 150 executives. I was supposed to give a little talk. And there's another lady who stops, whose car stops, and she gets out of the car and she said, Professor Rao, Bhashan dene ke liye aaye hain. You've come here to give a speech. I said, yes. And I said, what brings you here? So with pride, she tells me, main bhi Bhashan dene ke liye aaya hu. I've come here to give a speech. I said, wonderful. And what is the topic you're talking? She looks at me, smiles and says, the right to pee. I said, excuse me? I knew what she said, but I didn't want to reach the conclusion of it. The second time she smiled and said, right to pee. And I said, excuse me? And then she knew that I didn't want to commit to an understanding. And she then turns to me in Hindi, पेशाब करने का हक के बारे में बात कर. She went blown away. I said, oh my God. I said, Peshab? She said, huh? And then she goes before me. I had tears in my eyes. She grew up in a mohalla in Mumbai. And I didn't know this in the community, in the Muslim community she belonged to. After puberty, you had to use the bathroom. There was no bathroom inside the house. You had to go out. And after puberty, you had to ask your dad's permission to go out. I mean, can you imagine that? To go and pee or to go to the bathroom. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I would think of that as a serious kind of limitation of freedom. I mean, in the end, you can't, if you're not free to take a leak or go to the bathroom, I mean, I don't know what kind of freedom you're talking. She gets married and then thinks, oh, I can do this on my own. And much to her consternation, she has to ask her husband's approval. She fires the husband and she launched a movement to get the municipal authorities in Bombay to build 200 bathrooms for women. So I just stood up after her and I said, I don't think I can talk. What is it I can tell you about scaling up excellence? Look at how she scaled a dream into a movement. I'm always very aware that you don't learn just from other professors, other executives. You learn from just about anybody. I think the more we kind of realize that, I think the more open we are. It's not just, people in companies and people who are like opinion gurus or whatever, it's like anybody can actually teach us. In fact, there's a lovely Thumri. I'm a big fan of the Thumri music from India. And I forget the exact Hindi words. And the Thumri features, of course, the Thumri is a song form or a music group.
Sure.
Mostly with Krishna and Radha and various other things. In this Thumri, Krishna crosses the river and there is the boatman who helps him cross the river. At the end of the journey, when Krishna reaches the other bank, Krishna is taking out money to pay the boatman. And that is when the boatman kind of said something which was, I thought, phenomenally insightful. So he tells Krishna, ये कैसा हो सकता है? हम और आप एक ही बिरादरी में. I take people from one shore of the river to the other. You take people from one shore of life to another.
Oh, lovely.
Isn't that a beautiful thing? He says, how can I take money from you? Some dono to ek hi biradari mein hai. Look at how brilliantly he reduces the distance between Krishna and the boatman. I always have loved that Thumri. It sort of speaks to me, and learning and listening, and you learn all kinds of crazy things. Our gardener, Felipe, often we sit and chat and he tells me stories of how they make birria with goat in Mexico. I said, how do you make it? And he said, well, the little kids chase the goat around. And I said, really? Why do they do that? And he came up with a theory that I had never heard before. He said, if you actually chase a goat for a long time, a lot of the toxins come out as sweat. And so the animal actually is a better animal to eat. Now, I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but it had the wonderful quality of being plausible.
Yeah, and the careers are, our journey through life is all about exploring different stories that we hear, and they are all made up of stories, so yes, that is, of course, so powerful. We are coming up at the end of the hour, and Huggy, it's been fantastic, hearing your own career journey, looking at all these lovely books and some of the things that you shared, which, I'm going to really keep out there. I've made those notes. Some of the things will always stay with me, that, how do you treat your career like a journey and not a destination? Kill the good idea to pursue something better. Curiosity and generosity are practices, not traits. Thank you so very much for sharing this. Indeed, very grateful. And that's one of the best things about doing this podcast, is I get a chance to learn from people I would have otherwise never met in my life,
And likewise, and I think, but that's the point of conversation, right? To exchange stories. But my message to your audience is, remember, be the editor-in-chief of your story. And make sure you don't bring curiosity and generosity just to work. Make sure you bring them home.
Absolutely. Thank you so much once again. I appreciate your taking time to do this. And
absolutely.
Thank you. If you have any questions, you have my email there. Drop me an email and we'll be in touch.